A leadership made up of mostly 70 and 80-year-old geriatrics have pushed the same politics for decades. Stagnating living standards, growing internal strife, a new leader who treads a new radical and controversial course. A country involved in an expensive and never-ending conflict in Afghanistan to prop up a friendly government. A race with another superpower in which economics predicts you might lose. And a growing rift with long-time traditional allies. These things make us all think of one thing, the USA of today. But what if I told you I was speaking of a different country? The Soviet Union of the 70s and 80s. A few months ago, I read a book about Gorbachev and the fall of the Soviet Union, and I was startled by how uncanny the similarities were to the USA of the last 20 years. And now that Trump is back in office and more similarities have begun to fall into place, I felt the need to make this video. But before I begin discussing these extremely fascinating events, I must preface it with something. This video is more of a thought experiment and is not as rigorously researched as my other videos. Much of this will simply be me speaking my mind and as such what I can remember. Some errors will therefore slip by. Well, into the fray. Let's begin with the elder statesmen. Remember this debate?
Elder care, making sure that we continue to strengthen our healthcare system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
The rambling of an old man who it seems would rather find more comfort in front of the crossword rather than the TV cameras. Biden represented one of the biggest critiques within US political discourse of the last few years. The nation is led by geriatrics who seemingly have one foot in the grave, lacking the energy that all have clamored for as a necessity in revitalizing a nation in stagnation, and far worse, a leadership disconnected from the actual people they ought to represent. This isn't just the feelings of a misinformed people. As all facts point out, the age has been increasing. By 2020, the average age of members of the House of Representatives was 58 years, and Senate members 65, nearly retirement age. Not only were the politicians ancient, their policies were felt by many as more fitting in another millennia. And would you believe it? Most are, especially the economic ones. The US economic policy has more or less remained unchanged since 1980 when it began with Reaganomics. The few policies which have deviated from such a course, such as Obama's Affordable Care Act and Biden's Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Acts, have been far and few between. All administrations since Reagan, both Republican and Democrat, except the current one, which I will discuss later, have continued the neoliberal vision of global free trade, further privatization, less regulation, and in most ways followed the idea of trickle-down economics. For the USA, this economic policy has exploded wealth inequality. Just look, for the top 1 percentile, it is green line go up. Meanwhile, US real wages have remained stagnant, and all in all, the common American have not gained the fruits of the economy, and area after area has become dilapidated, something which has fueled resentment how things are and demands for a new direction. How was it in the Soviet Union then? Quite a similar picture. Like how the US economy boomed in the post-war period, the Khrushchev era in the late 50s and 60s saw the life of the average Soviet citizen become better, as it was an era of focus on consumer spending and some liberalization, rather than Stalin's strict hyper-industrialization. However, when Khrushchev was ousted in 1964 due to his policies being seen as a threat to Soviet stability, the new leadership of Brezhnev and his compatriots would, in their efforts for stability, be quite conservative, reversing many of Khrushchev's risky de-Stalinization policies. Brezhnev would also soon become the front face of the aging party apparatchiks. While he would come to power at 57 years old, not too old, he would remain in power for a long time, dying at 75 in 1982. Sure, that is not that old, it isn't even the age of Biden when he was inaugurated. By 1980, however, the rest of the top members of the important Soviet Presidium, Politburo and Party Secretariat were not young to say the least. The premier, Kosygin, and his successor, Tikhonov, were both in their mid-70s. Second in line to Brezhnev, Deputy General Secretary Suslov was 78, Minister of Defense Ustinov 72, First Deputy Chairman of the Presidium Kuznetsov 79. Brezhnev's successors were not young and spry either. Yuri Andropov was 67 when he was elected General Secretary of the CPSU, soon turned ill and would die 2 years later and be succeeded by Konstantin Chernenko. a 72-year-old man who would live on for only a year and a month as leader of the Soviet Union. You can really see what the problem was for many Soviets when they were feeling that their elder statesmen were a teensy bit too elderly and unable to act as needed. As Brezhnev also came to power, a change he made was that the investment in the economy was once again tilted back toward the heavy and weapons industry of the Stalin era, having the consumer industry sector lag behind. Furthermore, Brezhnev failed in implementing any necessary reforms which were needed to revitalize the economy in the face of future and new forms of economic challenges, such as the 1973 oil crisis. He also failed to fix the problem in the agriculture sector, which had forced the Soviets, even with a massive Russian steppe and rich Ukrainian soil, to import food. It would turn out to be a huge problem, as this failure would become a massive problem for Gorbachev in the late 1980s, as food imports would drain money from a budget that was already overbloated and thus ballooning Soviet debt. This debt problem would be one of the many nails in the Soviet coffin, but perhaps one of the worst. Not only was the interest on the debt a greater and greater part of the Soviet budget, when the economic reforms of Gorbachev led to economic uncertainty, a problem arose as something was needed to fill the growing hole in the budget. But in order to be able to keep the military-industrial complex and different interest groups happy, he could not make drastic, but needed cost cuts. To keep the books green, the state only had three options remaining: borrow money, print more money, or raise taxes. The last option was a non-starter. Any such tax hike would probably have been the end of Gorbachev, as popular sentiment would have seen him out of office on a shorter notice than the time for a head of cabbage to rot. Therefore, the only remaining way out was printing money and borrowing. Gorbachev and his advisors decided on both, and thus an increase in both debt and inflation. Inflation that would slowly but surely impact the lives of regular Soviets as prices of food, energy and other daily necessities grew and grew, and finally by 1990 soar. Sound familiar to the last few decades of American fiscal policy? It sure does. The Biden-era spending on an already tight budget to combat the economic and human cost of the pandemic led to high inflation and a lower standard of living for most Americans. A fascinating but simply coincidental fact is that the pandemic and its cost reminds me of the Chernobyl catastrophe, both costing the nations a fortune the ill could afford to spare. Furthermore, another similarity, this less coincidental, is that Biden's and previous administration would retain or even increase government deficits, mainly military, even as any necessary but political suicidal tax hikes were pushed to the sidelines. For the Soviet Union, while inflation and debt were ever increasing, the Union, slightly bruised, could remain somewhat stable. What would, however, be the killing blow was that when the economy grew more and more unstable, loaning from the West became harder and harder as it became more and more uncertain that the Soviet guarantees for the loans were to be upheld. The economy of the US has not yet reached this level of economic despair, and a few months ago I would simply call this fascinating but coincidental, not a cause for concern that the US would face the same issues. I mean, many of the other big world economies such as Japan and China are also heavily indebted. However, the last few months of Trump's economic policy has made the situations more and more alike. Not only has Trump thrown the US into economic uncertainty, recently prices of US-issued government bonds were decreasing, which means a lower trust in the US government as a reliable borrower, and just recently their credit rating was lowered. Worrisome signs ahead indeed. Now to the international politics. In 2021, the Americans scrambled out of Afghanistan after 20 long, grueling and deadly years of involvement in a counterinsurgency to prop up a friendly government put in place by the Americans. Those who took power after the Americans left, the Taliban, had leaders who, 30 years prior, had been part of the larger Mujahideen, a group who, with the support of the CIA, had pushed out the Soviet Union and torn down the communist regime in Kabul. The Soviets had entered into Afghanistan in 1979 after ousting the previous communist government in a convoluted mess of intra-communist factionalism and Cold War politics, which by itself would be an entire video. All that is needed to be known is that after this, the Soviets were forced to stay in country for 10 years in a guerrilla war against a force of mainly Islamist militants. This due to the fact that the Afghan government itself was far too unpopular for a large and trustworthy armed force, nor had it the economic resources to fight the civil war. Thus, the Soviet Union poured money and men into fighting and supporting the Afghan government. The Soviet dead after 10 years was more than 15,000, with more than 50,000 wounded, and the cost was nearly 20 billion rubles, about 115 billion US dollars today. But more important was the hit to Soviet prestige around the world. Just like the loss of the Vietnam War to farmers in paddies broke part of the visage of US superiority, the idea that the other superpower could be defeated by a ragtag bunch of shepherds in the hills had a similar effect on the Soviet Union. So, do I even need to spell it out? The similarities are striking. For large swaths, it's the same enemy, and I mean not just in the same group, it is literally the same guys. The US involvement in Afghanistan may have begun due to different reasons, but the course of events and the outcome are very alike. After a quick push, the US were able to oust the Taliban and get a friendly government in place. Still, just like the Soviets, the Afghan army would be unable to single-handedly fight the insurgents and thus need allied aid. The US would pour men with 2,400 dead and 20,000 injured and a lot of money. I mean bamboozling large sums of money into fighting in Afghanistan. Just like with the Soviets, the US involvement, even at this magnitude, would fail to succeed, as in 2021 the US began a swift withdrawal, which was quite a debacle, and the American-backed government fell in short succession. With so few years since the withdrawal, the true consequence of the US involvement is yet not fully known. Some, such as highlighting the decreasing US role in the Middle East and lowered interest for global entanglement by the US public, have though been seen. The withdrawal hurt American prestige, showing once again that the US can be defeated. But will the war in Afghanistan have been a larger part in what is to become of the US? Who knows? Yet, it would be fitting if Afghanistan gets one more for the record, befitting of its name as the graveyard of empires. This is the main similarity in international politics. The rest of this discussion will be more hypothetical, as it's about events that are still ongoing and not as similar. One such similarity is that by the late Cold War, the Soviet Union was in a global arms race with the US, in which the United States was pouring in resources at a level far greater than the Soviets could sustain with its stagnating economy. This arms race was lost by the Soviets, but it was not a large factor in its decline. The loss was more an outcome of it. The only main effect it had was causing the Soviet generals to refuse Gorbachev's pleas for a smaller military budget. A hurt, but not a death blow. The likeness to the competition between the US and China today is there. The Chinese economy and its military expenditure is rising at a level greater than the United States, but will the US be able to rival it in the future? Who knows? Yet, the competition between the US and China is not the same. The Soviets and the US became superpowers at roughly the same time. The Chinese, on the other hand, is an up-and-coming rival, more alike to Germany's challenge of British hegemony in the first decades of the 1900s. The Americans are a step ahead of the Chinese, while the Soviets in many areas lagged behind the US during the Cold War. So this is an interesting similarity. However, far too many of the factors differ to say that one can be compared in depth to the other. Still, the main thing to look out for is if the Chinese are able to maintain their astronomic rise while the US lags behind, unable, due to its economy, to sustain the global effort to challenge China. And economy isn't the only tool in the arsenal of American dominance the world over. The main one has been, and is, its Great Alliance system, unrivaled across the world since the fall of the Soviet-dominated Warsaw Pact and its affiliated countries. Within the history of the Soviet alliance system lies another possible similarity, and if the US alliance system goes the same way, it would be disastrous for its global hegemony. The Soviet alliance system of communist nations was, by the end of 1950, stretching from North Vietnam to East Germany. In the 1960s, however, this alliance would split in half as Mao Zedong in China would condemn the Soviet de-Stalinization, cooperation with the West, and finally its rapprochement with Tito's Yugoslavia. The Sino-Soviet split would divide the two most influential communist nations into two camps, which grew ever more hostile against each other, escalating in 1969 to border clashes and nearly nuclear war. As the contention over the communist leadership grew, each communist party the world over were forced to choose a side, splitting the global and every national communist struggle in several parts, never to recover. The US alliance system is currently not facing any similar schism, but even here there are clouds on the horizon, signaling something might be changing. There is currently no country which is the same as China was to the Soviet Union in 1960, but there is one entity which could play a similar role, the EU. If the European Union manages to consolidate into a more coherent foreign policy actor, and the divide between the US and its European ally grows, the EU, just like China in 1960, might be able to challenge the US as an alternative force, splitting the American allies into two camps. This is however extremely far ahead, and even then mostly speculation, which is the issue when talking about topics that are still underway, and especially so with the volatility that is caused by such an erratic force as the Trump administration. The final area of similarity is leadership. As the Soviet Union's problems grew, a new leader was chosen in 1985, Mikael Gorbachev. The hopes of many turned to him as he promised to rectify the situation and fix the nation. Gorbachev, who since the 70s had risen up in the Soviet party system as a regional head, had by the 80s become a close ally and confidant to Andropov, head of the KGB and after Brezhnev, leader of the Soviet Union, and was thus a clear choice for the leader to continue the reforms Andropov saw as vital. But unlike Andropov's gradual economic reforms, Gorbachev favored a much more radical reform program, believing that any successful revitalization of the Soviet Union required democratization and liberalization of both the economy and the political system. The reform became the dual program of Perestroika and Glasnost, restructuring and openness in English. Perestroika was the economic program where the state-planned economy was step by step devolved and made into cooperatives or privately owned companies. I won't go into all the details of this program, but the result was quite a failure. One of the main reasons for this failure was a problematic combination of Soviet currency with the privatization of companies. The structure of Soviet currency is a complicated issue, and this is not simply me being a nitwit. The book Collapse, the Fall of the Soviet Union literally states, quote, "Only a few professional bankers in the Soviet Union understood how this system worked, and meanwhile this unique system was vital for Soviet macroeconomic stability." End quote. But to simplify matters, the Soviet Union had two parallel currencies commonly known as Besnal and Nal. Nal was the money people earned as wages and paid groceries with. Besnal, however, was more alike to government subsidies. It was used for industrial investments and buying of resources, etc., and under no circumstances be used to pay employees. The system had been kept in place to ensure that the government could print money for investment and not suffer rampant inflation. The system had been kept watertight since the days of Stalin, but Gorbachev and his economic advisor Ryzhkov would break that barrier. Although at first not knowingly, they simply failed to grasp the magnitude of their mistake. However, some of the new cooperatives and recently created private banks realized that this had happened and that there was profit to be found by buying resources at state Besnal prices and selling them at returns of 500% in Nal. This is an example of one of many of Gorbachev's reforms that was made with a lack of understanding of reality, but was pushed forward due to ideological belief. And damn, was that man a devoted ideologue. I mean, in his ideological pursuit he literally moved to ban alcohol in the Soviet Union. 10% of the state revenue came from alcohol tax. What was he thinking? His ideological passion was also seen in the political reforms of Glasnost. He truly believed in democratization of the Soviet system, removing state censorship on media and finally allowing local and national elections, alongside with loosening central party control. The decentralization, however, was a bit odd in that it didn't give power to the local party officials. It simply vanished. Gorbachev also pushed for the greater inclusion of politicians not belonging to the Communist Party through electoral reform. But here's the thing. After more than 60 years of totalitarian one-party rule, these were nowhere to be found, except in one thing: local ethnic leaders. As Glasnost continued and the troubles of the failures of Perestroika were mounting, many felt that the only thing binding Soviet citizens together was their ethnicities. And when these grew stronger and stronger, especially in the Baltics, they began clashing with one another. Armenians against Azeris, Russians against Latvians, and on and on. And when the system finally grew extremely unstable, even former local party heads began singing the song of nationalism, most prominently in the Caucasian republics and in the Baltics. But it wasn't the nationalism in the Soviet hinterland that would break the Union. It was the nationalism in the Russian and Ukrainian Soviet republics that was the most frightening to the party tops. The Russian movement for greater autonomy was led by Boris Yeltsin, a former party top in Sverdlovsk, a city in the Ural Mountains, who had risen up the ranks of the Communist Party and received a position in Moscow in the mid-80s. However, Yeltsin had become disillusioned with the Communist Party, and with Gorbachev's Glasnost reforms allowing political activities of non-party members, Yeltsin split from the party and formed his own movement, advocating for a faster reform program toward Western liberal democracy and a new union with greater local autonomy. and yet at the same time upheld the discourse of Russian preeminence in the Slavic world. As the promised results of Gorbachev's reforms failed to materialize, more and more Russians flocked to Yeltsin, and when he was elected head of the Russian SFSR in May of 1990, he began to take control of some of the Central Soviet bureaucracy and allocating the power to the Russian SFSR, taking control of universities and central banking that were within the boundaries of Russia. Yeltsin, however damaging he was to the unity of the Union, never intended for it to completely break apart. He always held the belief that the Union should exist between the four central republics of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. What would, however, break the camel's back would be Ukraine. By 1990, with the greater openness of Soviet society and ever-increasing local autonomy, Ukrainians had gradually grown more and more accepting and even expectant of Ukrainian independence. However, by summer of 1991, this view was still held by a minority of Ukrainians, most still felt Soviet. So how would this break the Soviet Union a few months later? It boils down to one event. In August 1991, top leaders of the Soviet Union, fearing the direction the reforms were taking the Union, seized Gorbachev as he was vacationing in Crimea and took command. When this coup failed, partially because they failed to arrest Yeltsin, allowing him to make a firebrand speech from the top of a tank, many Ukrainians felt that the center in Moscow was no longer directing things, even after Gorbachev was reinstalled. Sensing a shift in public opinion and preparing for local elections in Ukraine, the leader of the Ukrainian SFSR, Kravchuk, began to propagate for an independent Ukraine. The following elections and referendum on Ukrainian sovereignty was both won by Kravchuk with a landslide. Even a slight majority in Crimea voted yes in the referendum. Ukrainian independence would unravel the Union, with republic after republic declaring their independence, finally ending when Nursultan Nazarbayev declared Kazakhstan independent on the 12th of December. Just as our leader in the Soviet Union rose to the position of power with his promises to fix the nation, the US has seen a similar figure rise to the top, Donald Trump. While Trump during his first term was a controversial and groundbreaking figure in US politics, his first term was not all that radical compared to the changes in the Soviet Union. Trump's first term kept much of the old guard of the Republican Party at the top, and many of the changes he made, such as the pivot toward Asia-Pacific, had begun under Obama, and Biden will remain on that course. The only truly different policy of his term would be his climate policies, which Biden attempted to reverse. What really impacted US politics with Trump's first term was, in my opinion, his rhetoric and the decisions of those following him, be it local governors such as Ron DeSantis in Florida or the appointments he made to the Supreme Court. What I generally think was Trump's first massive divergence was his denial of the 2020 election results, which even got him in hot water with his traditional Republican vice president. But now, with the man back, angrier than ever, and also more rambling, he has no longer seen fit to fill his rank with the traditional conservatives. With this new mandate, and surrounded by yes-men, Trump has decided to implement some questionable decisions. His tariffs feel implemented by someone who clearly lacks understanding of both what they do, but also what their purpose is. In one sentence he says they are leverage, and in the other they are supposed to bring back manufacturing to America. And just like with the risky reforms of Gorbachev, these two have led to economic instability, and with the flip-flopping it has failed to realize any of its purposes. Thus, it seems that it will only lead to hardship for more Americans, just like with how Perestroika failed to revamp the Soviet economy. But, I hear you say, the economic situation is bad, but it won't break the US into pieces. This won't even be the first economic catastrophe in 20 years. It won't even be the second. And that's a great point. It won't. But it may make things worse for the US. And if combined with a smaller central state and increased tensions between groups within the US, it might. These two things are what is actually dangerous to the integrity of the United States. And if Trump's administration continues to plow its course of giving up central power by dissolving the Department of Education or ending birthright citizenship without clarifying which parts fall under the control of the states, it risks simply evaporating and beginning the breakdown of social unity. Furthermore, Trump, with his misogynistic rhetoric, antagonism towards non-whites and deportation of immigrants of specific communities, may further the already growing polarizations into a chasm. States might then feel a need to take matters into their own hands and join forces with neighboring states of similar stances in order to continue running things in a at least workable fashion, quite similar to what happened in Ukraine in 1990. However, we mustn't forget that the US isn't divided upon ethnic lines, as was the case in the Soviet Union. There is no division of the US in which all African Americans live. The increasing racial divisions are harmful to the US, but rather in a similar manner to the troubles in Northern Ireland, where cities, towns and streets were divided and fought against one another, not divided into countries. There are many crazy and frightening similarities between the US of today and the Soviet Union 35 years ago, but one thing isn't the same: Trump and Gorbachev. While I have touted the likeness of their reforms, they are extremely unlike the other. For all his faults and failures, Gorbachev was an intellectual who often would consult the writings of Lenin, in which he seemingly believed true. He knew the Soviet system and how to play it, as seen by his extreme fear of meeting the same fate as Khrushchev by leaving Moscow for a vacation. But first and foremost, he acted in the belief that what he did would improve the Soviet Union, and not in the interest of amassing power for himself, because he gained that power. During the late 80s, Gorbachev, in an effort to fix the Union, had accrued more power for himself than any Soviet leader since Stalin, yet gradually he willingly gave much of it away. Trump, on the other hand, seemingly abhors intellectuals. He seeks power for himself at every turn, and with his small bribe of a $400 million plane, doubt is clearly cast upon his proclamations of acting for the United States. There is, however, one figure who played a pivotal role in the fall of the Soviet Union, which I find very similar to Trump. I have already mentioned him. None other than the drunkard himself, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin is alike in many ways. He was never a big fan of intellectuals, which is one of the main reasons he could never get along with Gorbachev. Furthermore, Yeltsin was a populist. He didn't really have a set of congruent policies, he simply picked and chose whatever fit the situation best. And most of all, Yeltsin liked power. In 1993, he, as president of Russia, would send tanks to blast the Russian parliament when it refused to give more powers to the office of the president. Yeltsin also surrounded himself with yes-men, and his lack of understanding of economic policies, together with his acquiescence of oligarchs, who often were friends of his, making themselves filthy rich by swooping up the former state-controlled enterprises, would worsen the economic situation in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But even though Yeltsin was bad, he was still just a loud voice, using nationalism in order to rise upward and challenge Gorbachev. He would be too inept to properly handle the catastrophic situation which Russia was left in after the fall of the Soviets. And by 1999, the Russia he had led was filled with people resentful of the state of the nation, yet filled to the brim with nationalistic and pseudo-authoritarian ideas from his rhetoric and actions, which would allow his Prime Minister Vladimir Putin to use that situation to find popular acclaim and with cold calculus remake Russia to a proper dictatorship, with him, for now, strong at the top. And for all the other hypotheticals in this video, this is the one lesson which should be drawn from the comparison. Trump might be a liberal voice who likes power, but he is a loud, bull-headed man prone to bursts of anger. The real danger is what his legacy will be, in the mindsets of Americans, which can be used by the next generation in the chaotic and dissatisfied America which Trump and his predecessors have created in the last 25 years. Zizek made a pointed remark about this. Listen.
I'm more afraid if Trump dies if Vance takes over. I think that Trump is more SA guy, you know, this vulgar, brutal. With Vance, it's terrifying coldness and so on. He is a robot.
This thought experiment has been really fun to make, and I hope you have enjoyed it. But remember, it is only a comparison between two different nations at different times. None of the events have occurred in a vacuum but are multidimensional and interwoven. All the extrapolation in this video is still simply hypothetical, and I hope none here takes this video to believe that the United States will implode in a week, but rather to use this as a good case for the need to compare the now with the then, to learn what not to do, and perhaps what can happen. For why else study history? But one thing is for certain, the US is undergoing immense change at the moment. And just how the fall of the Soviet Union forever changed the world, so will the current events. In what ways? I don't know. However, if there's one thing that I learned from studying history is that big changes and their aftermath, be it the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, the dissolvement of European colonial empires after World War II, or the spread of nationalism after the First World War, it always leads to the death of many, many civilians the world over. and the same will probably happen this time too. Thanks for watching.